that's fine.
All right, we may as well just get cracking on. Well, thanks everyone for coming from our talk. It is looking at from verification to infection, a deep dive into ClickFix techniques and fake CAPTCHA exploits. My name is Cameron Cottam. So who am I basically? Well, I'm a security operations analyst, a senior one of that at Adharma. It's a managed security service provider based in Edinburgh. I've been there since 2023 and it's coming up to 2 years in September, so it's been pretty good. Kind of investigate different alerts, triage, get access to different variety of tools, and kind of manage and help protect multiple clients in different type of industries, aviation, retail, healthcare, that type of stuff. I'm an Abertay graduate. I graduated in ethical hacking from University of Abertay in 2023. Apart from some of the hobbies I get up to, it's kind of slowly getting back into running and basketball. It's kind of taking a toll, kind of getting back into the actual proper stamina control, trying to deal with that. Apart from that, kind of constantly kind of pursuing new certifications and learning new stuff, different certifications, whether to kind of just expand your knowledge with cybersecurity. It's kind of, this type of industry is always like changing, it's always new stuff, so it's always good to kind of do these type of like things. Like Blue Team Online Labs, it's an excellent kind of like Blue Team kind of platform to like learn kind of different vulnerabilities or new type of attacks that have been seen by different security professionals that have made like kind of CTF style rooms. So kind of just to get some housekeeping away for the agenda. So we're going to be talking about kind of what fundamentally are kind of CAPTCHAs and the purpose of them within security, within the internet. What specifically is ClickFix? And kind of the rise of adoption of this technique by various threat actors and ATP groups. And then kind of highlight to kind of further expand this by looking at any notable campaigns used by kind of threat actors targeting different kind of clients in different sectors within the world. And then kind of looking at attack chain of this kind of malicious campaign by looking at kind of an example of an active ClickFix page. And kind of delving into the kind of techniques and tactics that this threat actors use to kind of basically compromise this device, and then towards the end, kind of give like a technical understanding of it being mapped to the MITRE ATT&CK framework to kind of show you kind of what techniques this attacker has done basically. And then lastly, kind of just look at some defensive remediations of like what can companies and say cyber defenders do to kind of prevent and reduce the mitigation of this type of attack. So before we talked about ClickFix, we've got to talk about what CAPTCHAs are and why do we use them. They're kind of fundamentally kind of used as like a web security to protect kind of websites from malicious bots or spam. You might see this when you try and log into accounts, create forms, or even say browsing on like kind of retail websites. They'll kind of ask you to verify that you're a human to prevent kind of DDoS attacks, and basically trying to overload the traffic by determining like you are a human in fact. So there's two types of CAPTCHAs. So there's CAPTCHAs and reCAPTCHA. reCAPTCHA is more of the newer version of this type of technology. It was originally kind of bought by Google in around like 2007. And basically the CAPTCHA test is designed to determine if you're an online user, really bot, like I mentioned there. The reCAPTCHA is meant to be sort of the replacement of this old technology, because more traditional CAPTCHAs were seen kind of just, as of the top picture there, you're just entering characters off a list and kind of just verifying yourself. reCAPTCHA kind of takes that further by keeping the traditional one, but expanding it further to include kind of image recognition and checkboxes like you click the box that you're not a robot, and it kind of processing in the background. So there's some variations, like I said. So there's many variations. There's the standard /ad injected CAPTCHA. As you can see, the one there at the top of the Dr. Pepper one kind of shows you a bit of monetization and security, where like different type of companies will pay to have their kind of brand within this to kind of drive up more revenue, and obviously enter kind of their slogan, their taglines, where it's like there's nothing like a pepper to easily get more views, get more kind of customers. Then there's the invisible reCAPTCHA, which is basically analyzes your behavior, what you're doing beforehand, before you kind of click the button, and just to determine kind of, is the activity kind of leading up to this point a legitimate user or if it's a bot. And then kind of the one you've probably commonly seen as well is picture identification or image recognition. Just kind of pick what pictures match this certain criteria, where it's like select all the squares of the clouds, and you can see the entire image is literally just all clouds, so it's kind of one of the more easier kind of CAPTCHAs to use. But they're not perfect. CAPTCHAs are not perfect. There's definitely some verification struggles, or you'll come to like random kind of type of CAPTCHAs that you'll be seeing that are just a bit kind of confusing, that confuses kind of end users, such as with the middle one where it's like select all squares with like the bus, and every square contains the bus, but you'll still fail to like verify that you're a human. Or there's the one the ones that always kind of annoy me is the one here on the right with the kind of click the traffic lights and the image cuts off midway through, so you're kind of debating, do I click this square, do I not? Will it actually pass me or fail me? Even though some of the times when you don't click it, you'll still pass, so it's not really kind of consistent, basically. So it's kind of looking at how users, because then users will kind of typically see a CAPTCHA and trust it, and will be frustrated within the process. So what attackers will do is they've taken that kind of frustration, kind of that ease, that simplicity, that user trust, to make this kind of new technique that's been became at least like a niche technique back in last year, but it's kind of become more prominent in recent campaigns this year. So we've talked about kind of what CAPTCHAs are, so I want to kind of looking forward from defense to exploit, how attackers weaponize these CAPTCHAs, how CAPTCHAs went from kind of, helping us defend from bots, DDoS attacks, but kind of ironically have been used by kind of attackers and kind of manipulated to basically as a kind of an attack way for them to basically exploit user trust and kind of compromise critical systems. So getting on to the main thing, so ClickFix campaigns, the way I like to describe it is click, verify, paste, execute, compromise. So kind of what do I mean by that? Well, what is ClickFix in this thing? It's a sophisticated social engineering technique that intends to deceive users into executing malicious commands under the guise of non-existent issues. Whether that be, say, you're connecting to, say, a threat actor will send a link to you to go to, like, say, a legitimate website to basically verify, oh, there's like a phishing email, say, like, you've got a booking.com review, you need to click on this, but then, oh, wait, you've encountered an error, you need to verify yourself. This is how they attract kind of victims, by this type of, this false sense of security, basically. Some notable threat actor groups are utilizing this technique. State-sponsored groups like Kim Sky, Muddy Water, ATP28, or otherwise known as Fancy Bear. They've been seen adopting this kind of ClickFix technique into their campaigns, and also T8571. They're kind of known for distributing malware attacks via phishing campaigns that employ ClickFix tactics. This was kind of initially observed by Proofpoint back in 2024, which they saw TA571 initially using this type of technique. And it's kind of slowly been adopted, as we'll see in the next few slides. And then on the picture is kind of examples of like what they typically will look like in the wild, where you click on it and it'll ask you to kind of press the Windows Windows icon plus R to open the run dialog box and basically paste the command and then press enter and you're quote unquote verified. But we'll get into what it kind of gets into that. So kind of, it's the Google Docs, Google Slides is not liking the format and all that. So kind of how are people kind of lured to these websites? There's different techniques that go about it. So there's malbursting, which is the type of technique that basically threat actors will kind of purchase legitimate ad space and post malicious content on there to try and deceive users. You might see this on like X or Twitter, whatever you call it, Facebook, Discord, in terms of, well, I'll get to the Discord part in a second, but that's basically how they distribute in that way. SEO poisoning is a type of way where they'll create a website and kind of manipulate the CSO kind of categorization of websites, where they'll try and push their website to the top of the result. So say, for example, a threat actor wanted to take the Laturda hack like domain, say they make it like top shop or top XYZ basically. They'll try and manipulate that to the top and say they did it around this time, where a lot of professionals are kind of browsing to the website looking for things. That's kind of how it goes. It's meant to attract users to kind of go to those websites and trick them. It can also be used to disguise as like kind of legitimate software companies as well. Drive-by compromise, that's basically kind of it takes like kind of a legitimate web service or website and compromises it, hosting malicious content in types of like subdomains or certain pathways that's been exploited. And then most of the common ones that we've probably seen and you've heard of is phishing or spear phishing via service. Spear phishing via service is basically just distributing kind of malware or malicious links via kind of messaging services like Discord, Twitter, again, Facebook, that type of way, even in like forum posts or comments. And then the one with phishing, kind of, malicious emails sent to your user, an executable file has been downloaded from a website, that type of way. So, talking specifically how this is kind of like a growing threat. So on the left side here, on the blue bar chart here, is the number of ClickFix campaigns observed originally by Proofpoint from March 2024 to October 24. And you can kind of see, what I kind of want to notice is like, you'll see on the first half of that year, it's kind of in a slow kind of number of observations. And it slowly picks up soon around August 2024 with around 14 campaigns seen. So it kind of indicates at least this was kind of a niche technique seen at the start of last year, but it's picked up towards the end. And on the graph on the right here is the observed number of ClickFix campaigns provided by the Dharma threat team. And that kind of looks at kind of around October 2024 to now. And you can see, if you compare March to 2025 and April to 2025 to this year and last year, it's nearly pretty much not even double, tripled in the number of observed campaigns that they've seen. I do kind of want to highlight as well, like, these are two different cybersecurity companies that have observed these campaigns. For all intents and purposes, these numbers could be quite higher. It depends what, like, kind of organizations or threat intel communities share these number of campaigns. These are just two different type of companies that have obviously gathered their own kind of threat intel, their feed, basically. So I want to continue that continue that on further. This is another graph provided by Proofpoint around kind of this year. This looks at the timeline of like actor campaigns and ClickFix sightings by grouping it by kind of different threat actor groups like T8427, T845, and like TA422, and also UNK Remote Rogue. So what you can kind of see here for these specific groups is the ClickFix sign is kind of very limited sign. You'll see one or two campaign observations from that on top of like their regular observed kind of regular phishing campaigns. You can interpret that in kind of two different ways. One, it's like Proofpoint may have not observed that type of campaigns regularly. It might have been kind of, could be the data they've seen, it could be different. Or you can interpret as maybe they're trialing this out, this new technique. Again, like I mentioned, it's kind of been picking up at the end of 2024. They could be adopting this type of technique into their TTPs, their tactics, techniques, and procedures to kind of mesh how this goes well with like their kind of like campaign structure and their like kind of different ways that they interpret it, basically. And I've kind of got the graph picture here on the front to basically just kind of basically highlight, it's kind of like the new hot trend technique that threat actors are adopting, basically. So some notable campaigns involving the ClickFix exploitation, like technique even, is Storm 1865, an obscure hashtag bat. So for Storm 1865, that was a phishing campaign that impersonated Booking.com that targeted a lot of hospitality sector companies across like the US, Europe, and Asia. That was initially observed by Microsoft. I'll talk about that in the next slide just there. And then Obscure Bat basically was a malware campaign utilizing ClickFix to deliver a rootkit called Root 66 to individuals on like typo squatted domains. In this example, it's like a Coinbase. It's obviously trying to be a typo domain of Coinbase, the cryptocurrency site, which I'm sure we're probably all aware. I go into kind of talking about specifically the Storm 1865 more deeply because while Obscure Bat did utilize ClickFix in their campaigns, they also utilized kind of other techniques of like masquerading as legitimate software that was actually malicious to kind of deploy their kind of malicious campaigns. But with Storm 1865, it kind of started as a mass phishing campaign towards, again, hospitality sector companies with different emails indicating like you need to verify your login or there's been a negative review placed in your business, you need to review this. Kind of, again, targeting, if you're a business owner, you're going to probably review that to see what has happened. And that's kind of, the picture here is kind of the kind of attack chain that Microsoft has identified with like how this threat actor occurred. Where it's like the kind of socially engineer kind of this user to click on the site, paste the command, it delivers kind of information steal malware that could be like Lumina Stealer or kind of remote rat tools. So a different variety of them. And then kind of information was stolen and then kind of exfiltrates like the threat actor C2 server. So I've talked about kind of a bit, highlighted like what ClickFix is, kind of the upward trends and stuff, and how it's basically kind of been adopted by different threat actors. So it's time to look at kind of like the attack chain of it, so how it's kind of structured, what happens after you basically click it. So kind of an overview of this section is going to kind of go into like the attack flow and highlight kind of key technical findings. Using like the sandboxing tool called AnyRun to perform, which is kind of commonly kind of used by security professionals for malware analysis and kind of investigating kind of malicious links and other activity. So I'm kind of going over how this attack works by breaking it down by looking at kind of the usage of the run dialog box, why your threat actors kind of getting you to paste commands in there, variations of this malicious command out in the wild, kind of the observed behavior and sandbox results that I've observed, and kind of mapping sort of the techniques I've seen into the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Because that's like being like in an MSP company, most clients will come and kind of want rules created and they want it mapped to specific kind of techniques and tactics. Whatever is like specified for their environment, because you've got to tailor, you've got to kind of like look at what they want coverage within their environment, basically. So this is an example I observed in the wild that I found on AnyRun, basically, from another user must have obviously seen this in a campaign, and so I found that and I thought it was quite interesting. So the website clients.contonology.com is actually, so the root domain of it, Contonology, is actually a legitimate web hosting company and is obviously being abused to host this ClickFix page. And this was first observed in anyone as around like 23rd of April. And the slide does say still active as to the day. I actually checked this morning, and it must have gone down overnight. So that was around, you can probably see that's been around for like maybe two and a half, and 3 weeks. So it's quite like a persistent type of campaign. And initially, like anyone linked this type of activity to Tycoon 2FA phishing kit. This is a type of like kind of phishing kit that allows an attacker to deploy kind of a reverse proxy server to intercept like the connection between the victim and the legitimate website they're trying to connect. In this case, you could make it could be like could be presumed that it could be the Contentology website this user is trying to connect. Again, because I'm not the original person that I first saw this thing in the email, you could make a guess if it was like this user may have found it via a phishing email or browsing to it by accident. But yeah. So how does this attack work basically? So as soon as the user visits the site and they click on the kind of the CAPTCHA page here, it basically, as soon as they click on the CAPTCHA box, a JavaScript file is run silently in the back end that basically already copies the malicious command to your clipboard and displays these simple instructions here. I've kind of these simple instructions here to look at to press and hold the Windows key, press R to open the run box, paste the command and enter, and you basically quote unquote are verified with like a little message here saying you will observe this like message here and you will agree to it. So in terms of these are the kind of the social engineering kind of tactic or messages they kind of paste here, where it's like verify you're a human, cloud verification ID. It's just nonsense. It's not going to verify yourself at all. This is just obviously done by the threat actor to kind of trick the victim and the victim to basically look at this and like, okay, so I must be getting verified. This is my unique number. So in terms of like the clipboard manipulation, like I said, it's a JavaScript file in the back end. For that specific IRC, it didn't really show much information in terms of like this JavaScript file. This is an excellent kind of blog here that's found it in the wild from Hunt.io. So it basically kind of looks like it's a JavaScript function that basically kind of sets a listener to wait for the user to click the CAPTCHA box, and it kind of runs the code to basically kind of dynamically generate this I'm not a robot message. They've got like a function here that kind of creates a unique number each time that the user goes onto it. And the command is sort of dynamic as well, like the actual malicious PowerShell command as well. It will go to the same kind of like infected website, but it will kind of change each time you enter it. I'll explain more about that in the next couple of slides there. So kind of, apologies for the presentation, putting the Google slides has messed it up. But so why the run dialog box? Why not just paste it in PowerShell? Why go this extra kind of step in simplistic? Well, it can be down to kind of 3 different kind of reasons. It's limited visibility. Once the user the run dialog box is basically a one single line box. It doesn't expand as more text you put in. So as soon as you paste that in, you're going to come up with a message where you may see like the I am robot not message here at the bottom image there, or you might paste it here, where in this case we do see like the encoded PowerShell command. So you would see maybe for the regular user, they might look at that, right, that command doesn't look correct, so I need to report that. But obviously if they see the bottom image here, I'm not a robot, reCAPTCHA verification ID, that might be like, oh, they might think that it's just simple troubleshooting, basically. And it kind of goes on to my next point where it simplifies user actions. A lot of users, like, end users, maybe not technical users, don't want to go through all the hassle of like kind of troubleshooting. They want clear, easy, outlined steps. And this is what this technique basically does, where it lays out kind of a 3-step plan to basically troubleshoot your connection issue, more or less. So it makes the user feel, again, like it lowers their suspicion and kind of makes them feel like they're doing actual like decent work, like they're trying to fix the issue themselves. And then the more important thing as well is it bypasses security monitoring tools. This type of like technique of pasting the command into the run dialog box is referred to as kind of indirect command execution on the MyAttack framework. It basically just helps attackers kind of bypass restrictions on like command line interpreters and evade kind of detection systems like group policies or endpoint monitoring. So the initial command breakdown, so it can be broken down into 2 different types. So there's the MSHTA-based command execution. MSHTA is basically the Microsoft HTML application process, and PowerShell command execution. So I've got 2 examples here. One's from the Contentology website, and one's from the Storm 1865 seen by Microsoft. So the Microsoft HTML application process basically execute a remote malicious HTML file, this being like a captcha.html on the threat actor C2 server. And it'll basically contain embedded commands. It could be either JavaScript, JScript, or Visual Basic script code that could be used to perform kind of additional actions, whether it's downloading and executing additional payloads or connecting to another type of like server. And the PowerShell command will basically be encoded command that intends to bypass execution policies and execute in a hidden window, trying to hide its activity in the background from the user. And it will create basically a COM object, which is just a way of saying like it'll create a file that will interact with the system resources on the device itself. So it'll get access to different type of functions and kind of for it to perform additional activity. And the net.web function is basically used to retrieve the file onto the device itself. And the thing to highlight here, the invoke expression is kind of basically whatever kind of results it gets from connecting to this kind of website here, the pc.io, it'll treat whatever string it comes out in, whatever string it receives as PowerShell code. So, kind of one thing, oh, the slide's messed up there. I can just talk it through. So what is so I kind of want to go highlight the MSHTA executable, kind of why it's a security risk. So it's so MHT or Microsoft HTML application is a process used to kind of execute HTML files that uses the same technologies as Internet Explorer, but it's kind of just outside your browser. It's kind of based on like your own device. And it's kind of, in terms of like today's business use case, I don't see it much used in terms of like day-to-day stuff. It may have been used in the past for like maybe legacy software or maybe like internal tools or administrative type activity. It just depends the configuration. The business use case, I don't see it as much in terms of day-to-day. But why is it security risk? Well, it can bypass, like it can bypass security measures and security controls to perform kind of binary proxy execution. Unfortunately, the text doesn't show up there because I didn't realize it was that color. But like on the right side is the MITRE ATT&CK framework. So that's kind of what threat actors will typically do is that they'll abuse that file and kind of execute malicious HTA files, which will contain, like I said, embedded commands via Visual Basic script and JavaScript. So in general, it's kind of not really much business use. It's more of it's become more of like, it may have been a legitimate Windows utility that had been used in the past, but nowadays it's kind of used by threat actors as a way to basically perform kind of remote code execution and kind of execute files remotely, trying to bypass certain security measures and monitoring and controls. So going back to the Contentology website, we're talking about the PowerShell command and the payload. So we've already talked about how like the decoder command connects to this pc.io website. This is actually a URL shortening service that will resolve to a top level domain called September Good Wine, which is a bit strange. But basically this page hosts like it's just a blank white page that contains a PowerShell command that, going back to the invoke expression thing, will take that string and treat it as PowerShell command. And what that command basically does is it invokes a web request to this suspicious URL called bit.ly.cx and basically download a zip file and they'll call it soda.zip and then basically extract it as a process called mssycon.exe. And then we'll proceed to kind of execute that suspicious file. It's just good if you could just remember like those type of names like the soda.zip and the mssycon ones. So what happens once it pastes the PowerShell command? Well, this is kind of the operations that was observed in anyone. So it was kind of disabling trace logs. It was modifying, or like, apologies, it was viewing kind of the registry key for enable file tracing under the kind of registry keys. It was more of a read operation because the tracing wasn't enabled in like anyone's like sandboxing thing. But this is kind of like a common kind of technique that attackers may use to kind of disable logging and try and reduce like type of like monitoring or coverage to like kind of hide their activity. And then the other type of stuff they might do is check in proxy server information, kind of gather kind of information about the device relating to like their network configurations and try and look at kind of maybe potential ways for device names and trying to basically help them map out their this like victim's like network environment. So kind of what was observed from the malware activity. So there's two major malware families observed. There was kind of hijack loader and Irec client 2, which I'll just call sec-top-rat for just the easier for me naming it, honestly. So once the malicious PowerShell command, it spawned kind of different multiple processes. It spawned a pi.exe, an mssetup.exe, and an xpfx.exe, which I'll talk about in the next, just talk about that in a second. But to talk about the two malware families, hijack loader is kind of a modular loader malware. It's kind of used to deliver and install multiple types of malware onto infected devices, and kind of acts as a launchpad to other payloads like rats, stealers, ransomware even. It depends on whatever the threat actor is configured in the end. And then sec-top-rat is kind of a .NET rat application that's kind of capable of kind of profiling the victim system, stealing sensitive information and kind of launching like a secondary test desktop to hijack browser sessions. Kind of just, again, obviously then connecting to like the attacker's C2 server. So the reason I kind of wanted to remember like the name of the file that was downloaded was kind of adaptive payload delivery. So for this specific kind of ClickFix page, the threat actor appears to be hosting multiple different types of malware variants on the site in terms of structure, because I entered the same kind of PowerShell command in 2 different instances via any run, and we can see here from the 2 screenshots here that it makes the same kind of request to the same website, but it's downloading the file in 2 different instances, where one instance is called voice adapter and then the other one's called placecatalog.zip. So it changes each time, and it's spawning a file each time. The interesting part as well is like the voice adapter.zip and the MS icon have been flagged before by VirusTotal for the tag trojan.lazy. That's the threat label itself is just more like it's detected it being part of a Trojan, part of different behaviors. It is probably doing malicious stuff in the back end, but it may have not been seen much in the wild or analyzed by other vendors, so they can't give it a clear kind of threat label. But you should take that label as like basically it is definitely more or less malicious. But the placecatalog.zip file has never been seen in VirusTotal before, and in uploading it myself, it instantly got flagged for like 2 hour 94 for kind of Trojan activity. So it just shows kind of, at least this is kind of a subtle kind of maybe evasion tactic where they're trying to rotate file names, possible different payloads to kind of avoid maybe static detection. So going kind of breaking down one of the malware families is kind of the hijack loader activity with the PyDA.exe and the FPX.exe. So according to VirusTotal, at least the PyDA.exe has been kind of, according to the file information, has been linked to an application called tvuplayer.exe. Appears to be some like ad streaming support application, which to me at least seems a bit strange and suspicious. However, from the execution parents here from VirusTotal for that file, kind of shows a lot of applications are kind of spawned from this kind of executable with kind of high indicators. A lot of them were kind of tagged for being kind of Trojans, rats. So it's obviously kind of the attackers using this application and masquerading as malware to kind of deploy additional kind of software. The xpfx.executable is kind of interesting because it's a signed executable with a valid certificate, and originally the file information was in Chinese. The translating it was an application called 360 Safeguard. It's basically kind of like an antivirus product suite part from a Chinese company called QI Who 360. What's kind of interesting as well, looking into the company, I was about to go into like a deep dive of like go into a rabbit hole of it, but basically they faced past criticism of security issues that were identified by different kind of Chinese companies for them installing kind of backdoors into their software. And kind of they've claimed to obviously patch this in like the versions that they reported it, but supposedly it's been seen in like future versions. So to me, at least from like that file being dropped by the pyda.exe, it could be potentially like an old version of this application that could be used as part of the rat process. So in terms of the hijacker, going further to like the hijacker loader activity, there was a suspicious file seen in the directory kind of the zip archive. And I'm not going to try and pronounce the name because honestly I think I'll butcher that. But basically it was downloaded, it was inside the zip file, and to me at least it looked quite suspicious if we look at the other type of files seen. There's like a lot of kind of different .ddl files and then a .ag file. So it's kind of, it's not really in terms of like, it doesn't fit kind of the other naming conventions of that. And kind of going further, it might, to me at least, it probably plays it kind of some role in type of the hijacker load activity. Maybe it calls to like that specific file and it connects from additional actions. Kind of the behavioral analyst from analysis and sandbox detections flagged this file as part of like hijacker activity on VirusTotal. It was interesting to me at least because anyone never actually flagged this file. It's seen it as being downloaded or like in file modification operations, but it was never actually like kind of flagged or detected as malicious by anyone, which again kind of shows that not every kind of sandboxing tool is kind of perfect. There is flaws with them and there is like kind of missed coverage. It's just you've got to do kind of that manual analysis in terms of like download the file and look at it yourself and do your own type of stuff. Don't always kind of rely on these type of like tools all the time. So going to the kind of the rat activity, looking at this specific process called the msssetup.exe. This is actually a legitimate Windows process related to Microsoft Edge update or Microsoft Edge. But however, this kind of application was dropped by the pyda.exe application. So there's a way, at least from a cyber defender perspective of analyzing it, you don't know if the contents of that has been modified, overwritten. Can't really be sure it's the pure legitimate application because it could be stuff in the back end. So what was interesting about this was this process was making an unusual connection, an outbound connection over port 9000 via HTTP request to this IP, this 45.61.165.167 IP. And then you see the URL request there. So to me, at least, it's like that's a very unusual connection for a HTTP request, and it's like, you know, it's kind of the IP itself was flagged as very highly malicious and used in kind of SecTop kind of campaigns. So it's obviously the threat actor uses this kind of IP or ranges as part of like kind of hosting their kind of C2 server. In terms of like the pathway, there's like the pathway can be kind of anyone's guess of what it could relate to. With wbin get, it could possibly Windows bin injection or web injection. It honestly depends what you can take. It's hard to tell when it's like that kind of limited information. And then the query string here is most likely just like the session ID or the victim ID, giving it to the C2 server to basically kind of, so this is like, say, Steve's device that's been infected, that's connected here, you can perform additional actions. That's most likely how it's like, what that query string translates to. So from looking at that, it's definitely like this process is malicious, looking at connecting to a C2 server, external on an outbound connection. So again, it flags as definitely like the device has basically just been compromised there. So in terms of kind of tactics and techniques used within the kind of MITRE-ATT&CK framework, there's been about 11 techniques seen with kind of, again, initial access I've kind of put there because, again, like I said, I've not kind of observed this myself initially. It's kind of what I found on any run. But typically how those sites are kind of accessed is via kind of more slightly drive-by compromise or phishing. So I kind of put those two together because that is maybe potentially how the user originally found this link. And then in terms of other techniques, or it's like command script and interpreter in PowerShell, this is in no order by the way, there's command script and interpreter for PowerShell, so after we've initially pasted the command to the run dialog box, hit enter, it's going to perform actions in the background, which leads to hide artifacts, hidden windows, improper defenses, and trying to disable kind of different types of defense mechanisms and measures within our user's device basically to hide their activity and kind of obscure like whatever's going on in the back end. And then indirect command execution, like I mentioned, placing the command into the run dialog box helps to kind of just bypass any certain security measures and controls. And rename legitimate utilities, like the ms setup.executable was a legitimate Windows process, but it's most likely been renamed or been altered in some way by this type of malware. And then kind of the C2 non-standard port connections and kind of query registry and standard and system information discovery. So what I kind of want to take away from this is, it's gone through a lot of defense evasion techniques to basically go and hide their activity from the user. Because typically with phishing kind of campaigns, you'll see the click on the link, go to a credential harvester, download it. This technique specific with ClickFix is obviously taking this type of, it's a mesh of different kind of techniques together to prove one. Like you want to make them paste the command, because once the command's copied to their clipboard, it's all entirely on the user's choice now. The user has to paste this command ordered for the campaign to actually kind of go into full effect. So it kind of goes back to how threat actors are basically wanting to trick users with how basically the appearance of this CAPTCHA page looks legitimate to them and kind of lure them into a false sense of security and just basically kind of go ahead and compromise the machine. So it's an interesting technique in how it blends different types of techniques. And again, this isn't just for like this isn't just like to describe ClickFix in total. You could have a very sophisticated campaign that can use multiple techniques entirely to perform additional actions. It depends obviously how these threat actors are kind of tailoring it to whatever they're targeting, whether it's like hospitality or healthcare. You know, it varies depending on who's actually the target. And this is just kind of just a visual overview. I wanted to, because I've kind of gone through a bit of like the technical stuff and kind of what's gone down. So this is kind of just a visual kind of overview of like what we've just talked about there. So kind of threat actor sends a phishing email to the Outlook or like an email provider, and our user Steve, I just picked the name to be honest, clicks onto the ClickFix page here, and then on the side you're going to command silently copied via the JavaScript onto the clipboard, and then a victim's machine executes the run command and then connects to like outbound connections and then downloads a zip file. And then around the end, it's kind of connecting to this, the RATA tool is connecting to the C2 server. So it's kind of a simplistic kind of overview of basically this talk to kind of streamline it a little bit. So we've talked about kind of the different types of ClickFix attacks and kind of different techniques used and how basically that maps to the MITRE-ATT&CK framework. So we've talked about how basically this is basically a target for companies and how it exploits systems. So how can we kind of defend ourselves? So kind of we want to shift from the attack to the defense aspect of it for blue team, and specifically for myself being in the blue team in the sphere. So I'm just going to kind of walk through maybe kind of different types of measures that companies could do. So that's where we move on to like the next section, which is the defense and remediations, from compromise to containment and how to fight back. So kind of the first one to go to is detection measures. So ways that you could do it is monitor for unusual executions, base 64 encoded commands, for example, as seen from earlier from the PowerShell type of activity that occurs, and even like suspicious external files being executed via the Microsoft HTML application. Because, as I mentioned there, it's not really used in much business use cases, maybe apart from maybe a couple of like legacy applications that you may have in your organization. So it's kind of just a way for, in terms of like, as an analyst, we need to be alerted for any of these type of suspicious commands so we can verify that if they're legitimate or they're like a concern that we need to take action immediately. And then other ones, it could be set alerts for kind of outbound connections, so kind of known malicious C2 domains and IPs, kind of using threat intelligence, using kind of updated feeds for like using on your different type of threat intelligent platform tools, or TIPS even, or TIPS is kind of what the acronym's kind of for it. That includes kind of like Threat Connect or Hive, different type of tools like that. And kind of monitor for uncommon ports and protocols used for C2, for example, like the port 9000, or just like kind of look for anything that's not kind of a standard HTTP/HTTPS ports, basically. And then lastly, kind of look at set kind of like detection alerts for kind of any suspicious file written /operations/downloads, kind of watch for executables or scripts written into the temp directory, as a lot of threat actors will write files into the temp directory to obviously kind of hide their files with other legitimate softwares, as a lot of kind of legitimate Windows applications will tend to access the temp directory, and it's kind of good for a threat actor to kind of hide their malware within that directory, as again, it's not really a common one that, you know, normal users will look at. And then finally, just kind of monitor for unsigned binaries or dropped files from like uncommon sources. As mentioned, like legitimate Windows application being dropped from a file that was flagged as pretty malicious, and it's no proper like name conventions, all that type of stuff. Really, it's just kind of, if it's not really downloaded by the user, it's kind of you should be monitoring kind of where's this file came from, is it legitimate, should it be within my device. So looking at the next one is kind of prevention measures. So I kind of broke this down into type of like 4 different types of sections really. So there's implement, which is implement email filtering for phishing indicators. So the type of indicators you could see is basically kind of detect lookalike domains, suspicious links, and brand impersonations. You'll get like a lot of that in terms of phishing campaigns, like part of the Booking.com one, for example, or other certain kind of companies might be kind of targeted to be impersonated by threat actors to masquerade their kind of true attack and, you know, try and like lure the user to click on the email. And then kind of next is like use advanced email gateways, or like sandboxing for attachment link analysis for suspicious links. So one tool I quite like using is Microsoft Defender for Endpoint. These type of EDR, XDR tools are very good for monitoring this type of activity if it's kind of configured properly and it's kind of you know what you're kind of working with in terms of that back end there. It'll good to detect files, but not to say necessarily it will obviously catch everything. The threat actors are all constantly like learning and evolving their techniques and their tactics to bypass these type of defensive measures. So the next one would be block. So basically, more or less, block kind of downloads of executable scripts from kind of untrusted sources, or even like kind of like restricted file types. So prevent delivery of kind of .ps1, PowerScript files, HDA files, or kind of other scripts from like the internet. Maybe it depends on your organization you deemed. There's like certain kind of use cases out there that will be looking for like kind of common restricted file types that you might chuck into kind of make it as a rule creation to monitor for that. And the next is kind of restrict kind of script execution permissions for non-admins. So does your standard user need PowerShell kind of for their account all the time? Or would you restrict it for just basically kind of system accounts, or kind of basically, do they really necessarily need it? Excuse me. And the next one is use. So kind of use application control or allow listening to prevent kind of unauthorized PowerShell execution. Kind of define, so kind of analyze whether certain applications like the MHTA or PowerShell should be authorized to perform certain types of activity. You can kind of do this by kind of defining kind of different types of policies, and kind of identifying what scripts within your environment is kind of commonly used by, like, say, like IT departments might use different types of scripts to perform kind of patching cycles or different types of configuration changes. And kind of enabling PowerShell constrained language mode for standard users. So so the constrained language mode is basically a way for PowerShell to restrict certain usages and certain functions for users that are under this type of category. So this would kind of prevent them from, say, as mentioned in the example there, creating like a COM object, basically. It prevents that type of function from being used and being called by PowerShell for that user, and kind of other additional actions that give like it access to the system resources. And then this one is kind of a group that kind of together, disable/apply. Disable MSHTA or the Microsoft HTML application executable if there's no legitimate business use case. Like I mentioned, this is kind of commonly used by kind of threat actors as more of a kind of an exploit to kind of perform like remote code execution and try and deploy it, kind of basically execute files on their remote server. Again, apply this through group policies or app locker rules to kind of block kind of execution creations of this application. And then if anything, kind of regularly kind of audit/alert for attempts to bypass these type of extractions. The attacker could be trying to just kind of, again, this isn't for specific for ClickFix, this is kind of just more in terms for specific, like kind of different cybersecurity kind of alerts and issues. But for like, specifically for this, it is kind of like, it helps to kind of show, for this specific technique that's becoming an upward trend, it shows what to kind of, what preventive measures we can take to basically stop the user from, to prevent the user from basically like, if they go to enter the command, these restrictions would in place to prevent them from actually doing it, or prevent it from any kind of like execution process. The next one is user awareness. Train users with like phishing awareness campaigns, but kind of extend it beyond what's currently kind of being set at the moment, kind of expand it to like fake CAPTCHA detection. So, you know, I imagine most people in like, if you're a professional, your company does kind of regular like phishing awareness campaigns, sends you an email from a supposed business email saying, we've reviewed our company policies or our holiday plan, please click this link to kind of review it. Again, this is also used by threat actors as well, but if it's used by internal companies to highlight kind of user awareness and make them identify phishing emails, like if it's the body of it looks kind of a bit suspicious or not like professional, the headers are not the same sender, that type of stuff. But basically kind of extend it to fake CAPTCHAs, because we need to teach kind of users to recognize legitimate versus fake CAPTCHA prompts. Because as mentioned there's a variety of CAPTCHAs out there. There's image recognition ones, there's the text, there's even ones where it's like custom ones for specific usages, which is like the ones where basically, in terms of describing it, is you will have a slider and it's like jigsaw type of thing, where you have to slide it to make sure it fits like this specific kind of area. So it's kind of good to highlight that. And then I guess, and then the next kind of awareness is kind of emphasize kind of the immediate reporting of a suspicious activity, given kind of the recent events in the past 2 weeks, which I'll get to that in a second. If a user is kind of asked at any point to run a command because of a CAPTCHA, they need to report it, because it's a clear process to, it basically is a clear indicator that's a big red flag if you tell it to an IT professional, cybersecurity professional, that like a CAPTCHA should never ask you to paste a command. But obviously, because if users are not very familiar with this type of technology or the risks or these new evolving threats, they're going to need to be basically educated. That's the kind of the problem. This is the kind of the thing with cyber. It's like you're constantly relearning, even after like university, you'll be constantly learning new stuff and pursuing kind of new type of training. So yeah, so attempt to like establish a clear process to contact kind of your IT security operations team when a suspicious page is encountered, because as soon as they report it, gives basically those teams more time to action it and kind of prevent it from occurring. Incidents, kind of the incident response scenario. So what if the previous measures I've mentioned all fail and the command is executed? Well, some ways we could look at it is EDR, XDR tools can be vital if configured properly to kind of detect and prevent this type of activity from either suspicious connection files or behavioral activity. I've kind of seen this in terms of my work at least a couple of times, but it's always been kind of CrowdStrike related detections that I've caught this type of activity. And CrowdStrike does a pretty good job at pretty much catching this activity as soon as it fires. It usually catches the spawn file from the command. So although like the victim may have connected to that domain and downloaded the file, CrowdStrike, at least when it's good, will detect that file and basically kill it and block it and quarantine it in cases to kind of prevent that kind of, to stop that attack chain from occurring any further. So in that case, and then if it does make those connections, you should isolate the device immediately from the network, and whoever the active user was on that device should have any kind of recent active sessions revoked and resend their kind of credentials to make sure, like, what if in the instance they made the connection and the threat actor managed to exfiltrate kind of the user's password, if it was on like a text file. It could be, again, it's a situation that could be dependent on who the user is. If you have like a top executive has a text file with like their username and password, gets exfiltrated, you're kind of like, well, we need to take preventive measures to protect their account as well. And then if necessary, which is probably I would say probably now is probably the best solution, is probably just rebuild the device from the last secure build. As mentioned there, like the malicious command is doing other stuff in the back end apart from like spawning these malicious files. It's kind of changing kind of checking registry information, it's querying kind of different device information, and making different types of directories, and calling different types of DLL functions. So yeah. So kind of just kind of like round it out a little bit here. Kind of readiness is kind of the key with what recent attacks have taught us. So over the past kind of 2-3 weeks with the co-op, you probably heard it from like Michael or James from their talks. You know, the past kind of 2-3 weeks have highlighted that no company's kind of really kind of immune to a cyber attack. Co-op, M&S, and Harrods have all been fell victim to a cyber attack over the span of kind of 3-4 weeks in very short span of time. So it's kind of need to be prepared, have an incident response planned, and kind of because you know next day the CEO of your company could easily could be compromised. It's like it's kind of an unpredictable kind of situation, more or less. You never know what's going to happen. So, and then I've got a couple of screenshots here from kind of like different articles that kind of highlighted. Again, these are with like the M&S saying potentially an inside source said that they had no incident response plan. There was nothing kind of what scenario would they do, what actions would they take if they came to the scenario. Again, this is an inside source. It's not like maybe not be a legitimate verified source. Obviously, these companies have very kind of high profile, kind of decent, like very large number of security teams, so they're probably constantly working over day and night right now trying to really kind of investigate these like kind of breaches. So what in terms of like could we do? Well, we could test your team, your environment, and the resources that you have, put them under kind of pressure to see what it would be like if a real kind of attack or scenario actually occurred. So kind of you could do this by doing penetration tests, kind of scheduling it. You could do some where you inform your blue team of like what activity is going to be happening, or kind of leave them in the dark. So like if it does occur, they treat it as a real incident. And then that gives, I guess, kind of, if you're a SOC manager, CSO, kind of, okay, this is what if they're aware of that, of the penetration test, it kind of gives them an idea of like, okay, so let's see how my team responds to like this threat that I kind of know is a pen test based on what I've been told, but they've not been told obviously because it's meant to test their kind of response time, their kind of analyzation of the event. And you can do like with blue team, purple team exercises, just wherever variation, it depends on like kind of your organization and what you kind of want to undertake. And kind of end it off, like resilience is kind of built before the breach. It's kind of good to build kind of resilience before the breach. Kind of act now to protect kind of your company's like future and resources, as in like most, like as soon as an incident occurs, typically like most of the kind of resilience is kind of, or harden your environment is built basically after a breach once you've kind of investigated the issue and identify it. It's good to kind of act a bit early, kind of identify this by like they mentioned like maybe like penetration tests or kind of specific audits or kind of reviewing certain configurations every now and again. It's good to just build that type of resilience more or less to make sure like your environment is protected for these type of incidents. So I've kind of gone over a little bit. I did have like speaker notes prepared about the Google Slides thing, so I would take questions or like if you just want to grab extra coffee and that. Yeah.
So first of all, thanks for the talk. To see, experience a bunch of this stuff, so it's really good to have a specific thing on it. The mitigations you suggested, locking down PowerShell, stuff like that, obviously good advice.
Yeah.
The problem is certain large organizations with legacy setups, it's painful and it takes a long time to put those in place. And so the temptation in our case has been just to disable run. Right? Obviously, and so obviously the locking down PowerShell and stuff would be better because at some point they'll stop just using run. People will be blocking run and so they'll move to something else.
Yeah.
And so because it's so easy to do. So where do you think maybe they're going to move once everyone starts blocking run? That's the first step.
It's a good question. Yeah, it's definitely kind of. I guess it depends how like kind of the threat actor looks at what they can exploit, because that is kind of like a very niche type of technique in itself. Like as in them entering the command in the run dialog box. Again, disabling that will stop that, but then obviously they look for new alternatives. In terms of like what I think might occur, it could be different type of techniques. So there's a talk I saw at Security this year that looked at SVG payload. So a threat actor will send like an image, a phishing email, sorry, to this victim, and it will contain like an SVG file. You think, okay, so it's kind of, the way from that talk was there's a way that an attacker can abuse kind of the code within that file to basically and kind of hide like a payload. So if they basically click on the image, it will put them straight to like a credential harvester page or any type of like a malicious site. So that could be another alternative we could see kind of coming up as like another technique. It's still like, that technique specifically is not new itself, but it's kind of similar to ClickFix where it's sort of gaining traction in kind of recent observation and like campaigns, I would say. And like I think like different type of techniques, if something gets broken, it kind of is, it may be a bit difficult to kind of pin down specifically what they move. I think it's just, again, maybe have your detection systems kind of configured correctly, kind of monitoring kind of what areas you think are kind of critical assets. Well, again, monitor everything by environment, but also kind of identify kind of very risk-based kind of assets or users and see kind of what activity you see in the wild. Again, like I said as well, maybe even like threat intelligence feeds might see like new techniques coming up. So initially this was kind of a, I think, if you, from like different type of articles and stuff, they all kind of reference Proofpoint as kind of the main source of where ClickFix came from. Again, not to say that they've seen it themselves, probably like they were the ones that first seen it. There could be another type of cybersecurity company that's seen it, but they're the kind of the ones that publish big kind of research like articles regarding it. So I guess kind of the answer is that it's not, I'm not too sure really. It could be kind of any type of thing, wherever kind of the threat is. It's a hard, yeah, it's
asking people to predict the future is not really.
Yeah, I think it more like I have to go back to like kind of what I said about the resilience thing. I do kind of go against my own point because you can't really predict what systems you can make resilient. Because, you know, again, like I mentioned, everything's kind of evolving. It's a constantly changing industry and like field. So the best thing, I guess, is to be, rather than be active, rather than being like active in terms of like these type of stuff, is more be proactive in these incidents, kind of identify identify areas and risks within like your environment or users. Like in Michael Varley's talk, he talks about how kind of there's not proper like kind of authentication measures or MFA set up for users, kind of that type of stuff. Really, just look at different types of security measures, I would say. So, any other questions? Yeah.
You mentioned people losing their Discord accounts. I remember a while ago, at least in the Discord clients, if you open up the console because it's just Electron, it had a thing that said, "Don't paste anything here unless you know what you're doing," in which case we're hiring.
Mm-hmm.
And then later on, they just removed it. It made it a lot harder to just open the console at all. And that I was reminded of that when you mentioned things like going out of a way to like restrict people's PowerShell access or like disabling one entirely. How much of like, what do you think is the middle ground in terms of like finding the right mitigation versus just going nuclear and taking someone's ability away to do something?
Mm-hmm. That's a good question, yeah. Again, going back to kind of like the user awareness kind of slide here, I think it's just about kind of educating your user base, really. Because you'll have like maybe a user that's kind of, for example, I've seen kind of ClickFix technique regardless of whoever the user's role. I've seen it for kind of users who are like mechanical engineers, which I don't know for anyone else in the room, but like from like mechanical engineers I know, they tend to be, they're great wizards when it comes to like hardware, anything that type of thing, but in terms of IT, they're kind of not as kind of, I guess, that fluid in with us, but again, like cybersecurity is kind of, we're meant to know this type of thing. But I've also seen kind of like an IT support specialist that's fallen for this technique as well. And again, I think it just depends on the type of like what your user is, right? So say you log in, you kind of no sleep, nothing, you're tired, or you feel ill, you could easily click on that by mistake and not realize it by the time you say it. In terms of like kind of going nuclear and kind of where would we fall in line in the middle of restriction and nuclear is more kind of making them awareness, but also can maybe try and see if you can add kind of prompts or kind of messages to basically say kind of here's what you should not see or you should not do. So for example, like sometimes when certain organizations, they might customize like their like kind of login, Microsoft login page, and they'll have like background images saying here's what not to do and like don't click any suspicious emails, don't execute any commands. So you can easily do that. Say it has like, again, like you could have it as like say like a default background on all kind of computers. That's one way you could look at it. Have like kind of an image, have like a company kind of profile, company picture placed on kind of forced on all devices. So like every time when the user log in, they'll see like these kind of warning messages where it's like, you know, click phishing links, don't click these phishing links, don't paste any kind of suspicious commands, and always like report to your IT. I mean, some users might be happy with that, some users might not, where they might want to obviously like customize their desktop or stuff. Again, not everyone's going to be kind of happy with like restricting it and kind of bypassing it. It's the same with like legacy systems. You can't really full-blown nuclear like kind of restrict that at all because these systems do rely on it.
You can for run. No one needs,
you can do it for run, yeah.
Needs run.
No one needs run. I don't legitimately you don't need run because it's
There's people that think they do, but
Yeah, it's just used as a shortcut. That's basically, yeah. No, yeah, disable and run entirely would probably mitigate this there's probably this technique in general.
Until it changes.
Until it changes. And in that case, it's kind of more kind of, would they just get into paste and CMD? Maybe. But then it depends. CMD or PowerShell, like I mean, like it is a specific way of indirect command execution by getting to paste in the dialog to bypass security measures.
Have you seen, like when you're researching this, did you see any ClickFix that didn't use run?
No, it's like the same with like, I've not seen very much of it related to like kind of targeting Linux devices. It's always kind of been targeted primarily to like Windows OS devices that I've seen kind of in terms of research and in terms of my day-to-day work. But I think I should have added in the slide here, but like there was one technique where like one campaign used ClickFix and they used kind of, I think it was con.tuk or something. It's a malicious type of JavaScript file, and it kind of, I think it added more on top of like the clipboard manipulation on top of it. It's kind of, it was that again, that itself was kind of a niche thing. It was kind of that was kind of seen when like this type of campaign was getting noticed by all different like organizations. So it's kind of the information, you'll see different variations of this technique. To be fair, actually, they like in terms of like the command connections, how like they connect to certain external websites. Some threat actors have even like kind of used like Steam profiles as a way. So with Steam, obviously you got your name and then you got your history of your previous names. So what some threat actors have done is basically kind of added those previous basically previous names that look like a URL pathway, and their malicious process will basically query like this random Steam profile. It's just a freshly created profile with this history of names, and it basically kind of forms and creates a URL together. So I mean that could be one way, like again, like how they might adapt this like type of command and stuff. But I think in terms of like where it would be executed, it depends what the threat actor's thinking. It's hard to kind of predict really, but I think it's just kind of tailor it to what your organization is in terms of restricting it and like blocking it, I'd say, if that kind of helps answer your question.
Makes a lot of sense, thank you.
No problem. Yeah?
You mentioned earlier that there's been quite a number of different like adversary groups that have been using the same sort of attack. When they're all using, say, the same kind of CAPTCHA into the run prompt, how easy is it to differentiate between the different adversary groups that are using it?
I think it depends. It's probably based on like what kind of the other kind of tactics, techniques, and procedures what they kind of use. Like I said with like ClickFix, they deliver different types of malware. It's not going to be like they might deliver just Luminous stealer malware to steal kind of different information regarding your device, or they just drop like a rat execution file and do that. I think in terms of like other organizations, threat groups, is if we go, it is kind of like a slowly kind of adopted kind of technique here from the graph from proof point here is. The majority of the time, you'll see there's a lot of high common normal observed campaigns of like related to that threat actor, and then it's kind of seen in variation. So even like TA422 and the UNK remote rogue don't really see it that often. Or well, I think TA450, I think that's one they just got the same slightly different color. But yeah, it's slowly. I think will we see kind of more for ATP groups kind of adopting it more in techniques? Most likely, to me at least, that graph. It's kind of them trialing it out, testing like the different type of how it meshes and how like they can tailor it to their target specifically. But I think it just depends, kind of just analyzing it and seeing what kind of investigating it, like what does it share links to kind of this file. CrowdStrike is quite good with it will link to like a list of different type of IOCs that they've seen, and it will kind of match it to the indicator. The ClickFix campaign I observed, at least, it tagged it relating to Curly Spider, which is like an ATP group, and I believe it was based in Russia. So I think that's one way. I guess that's kind of answers you kind of your question a little bit. Is if it depends on like the detection tool you use, the an EDR tool, it will sometimes link these type of IOCs or behavior activity to like a threat group that maybe CrowdStrike's observed in their own kind of in their own like sightings, basically. Any other questions or? Yeah. Oh, thanks everyone for listening to my talk.